In Millbrook Valley, a story of extraordinary kindness is about to unfold. For 30 years, Frank Morrison has been the town's guardian angel of broken-down cars, never charging a dime for his expertise. His weathered hands have fixed more engines than anyone can count, but it's the hearts he's mended along the way that truly matter. What he doesn't know is that when Sarah Reynolds Toyota pulls into his driveway with a failing engine, she isn't just another stranded driver. She's a tech billionaire worth $47 billion, secretly traveling across America in search of something money can't buy: genuine compassion. As Frank prepares to work his magic on yet another engine, he has no idea he's about to become part of a story that will change both their lives forever. The morning sun cast long shadows across Frank Morrison's workshop, its golden light filtering through windows that hadn't been properly cleaned in years. Not that Frank minded. At 72, he had long since learned that some things mattered far more than spotless windows. His father's toolbox sat in its usual place of honor on the workbench, its red paint worn thin from decades of use, each scratch and dent telling a story of someone helped, someone's day made a little better. Frank ran his calloused fingers over the toolbox's handle, feeling the smooth spot where his father's thumb had rested thousands of times before. "Another day, Pop," he murmured, his morning ritual unchanged after all these years. "Let's see who needs our help today." The workshop was more than just a garage. It was a testament to a lifetime of service. Every wall told a story, from the faded photographs of first cars repaired to the colorful crayon drawings from grateful children whose parents' vehicles Frank had fixed in times of need. His favorite wall, the one facing his workbench, was covered in thank-you notes, cards, and children's artwork, a tapestry of gratitude that had grown over 3 decades. The memory of Helen's voice echoed in his mind as he gazed at their wedding photo on his desk. "Promise me you'll keep helping them." "Frank," she had whispered 5 years ago, her hand squeezing his with surprising strength, even in her final days. "Promise me you won't let the world make you hard." He'd kept that promise every single day since. Mrs. Rodriguez's minivan arrived first that morning, packed with kids headed to school. "The brake light won't go off, Mr. Morrison," she explained, worry lines creasing her forehead. Frank knew she worked 2 jobs to support her family. A major repair bill would hit hard. 20 minutes later, he had replaced a faulty sensor, refusing payment as always. The freshly baked empanadas she insisted on leaving were worth more than any cash. By mid-morning, old Tom Wheeler had stopped by, not because his truck needed fixing, but because he knew Frank would listen to his worries about his daughter's upcoming wedding. "She's marrying a good man," Frank assured him, tightening a loose bolt on Tom's truck while they talked. "I fixed his mama's car last month. You can tell a lot about a person by how they treat their vehicle." The local high school's auto shop teacher brought his students by for what he called a field trip, but Frank knew better. These visits had become a tradition, a chance for young minds to learn that being a mechanic wasn't just about fixing cars. It was about fixing problems for people who needed help. The kids clustered around as Frank demonstrated how to diagnose a mysterious engine knock, their eyes wide with curiosity. "My dad says you're the best mechanic in 3 counties, one boy piped up, "but he also says you're crazy for not charging people," Frank chuckled, wiping his hands on his ever-present red shop rag. "Your dad's half right. Tell him I'm not crazy. I'm just rich in different ways." He gestured to the wall of thank-you notes. "See that drawing up there? That's from your sister when she was about 6. Your folks' car broke down on the way to her dance recital. Remember? The smile on her face when she made it on time, that's worth more than money." Lunchtime brought Mary Beth from the diner with his usual sandwich and a slice of pie. "On the house," she insisted, though Frank had fixed her delivery van's transmission. Last month, she paused by the door, fidgeting with her apron. "You know, Frank, Helen would be proud of you. The way you've kept going, kept helping folks. She always said you had the biggest heart in town." Frank felt the familiar ache in his chest at the mention of Helen's name, but it was a gentle pain now, like an old friend. She was the one who taught me about kindness, he replied softly. Everything good in me I learned from her. The afternoon sun was dipping low when Sheriff Davis pulled up in his patrol car. Just routine maintenance, he claimed, though both men knew he really came by to make sure Frank wasn't working too hard. The wall of thank you notes had grown again today. 3 new additions joining the hundreds of others, each one a reminder of why he kept his garage doors open, why he never turned anyone away. As the day wound down, Frank stood in his doorway, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Helen had loved this time of day, when the light turned golden and soft. Tomorrow would bring new cars, new problems to solve, new people to help, and that was just fine with Frank. Morrison, after all, he had a promise to keep. The sleek penthouse office on the 84th floor of Reynolds Technologies headquarters stood empty now, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a commanding view of San Francisco's skyline. Sarah Reynolds stared at her reflection in the glass, barely recognizing the power-suited CEO the media loved to photograph. Her hand traced the cool surface as city lights twinkled below, each one representing a life, a story, a person who probably thought she had it all, if they only knew. She glanced at the magazine covers framed on her wall. Tech's youngest female billionaire, the woman revolutionizing AI, Sarah Reynolds, the future of innovation. The latest Forbes estimate put her net worth at $47 billion, but sitting alone in her office at midnight, that number felt meaningless. The Toyota Camry's key felt foreign in her hand. So different from her usual luxury vehicles, she'd chosen it specifically. Beige, 5 years old, the kind of car that disappeared into any parking lot. Her phone buzzed again. Probably Marcus, her CFO, still panicking about her sudden sabbatical. She'd left him in charge with clear instructions. 3 months, no contact unless the company was literally on fire. You're making a mistake, he'd warned. The board won't understand. The shareholders, she'd interrupted, own pieces of paper. I own my life. It had felt good to say it out loud, finally. Sarah settled into the Camry's cloth seats, adjusting to their distinct lack of heated leather comfort. Her designer clothes and signature jewelry were packed away, replaced by items from Target and local thrift stores. The transformation had been carefully planned over months. She'd studied how to blend in, how to become invisible, despite being one of the most recognizable faces in tech. The idea had taken root 6 months ago, during yet another charity. Ugala. She'd stood on stage, writing another 8-figure check surrounded by applause and camera flashes. But later that night, she'd overheard 2 servers talking. These rich folks, they throw money at problems so they don't have to get their hands dirty. When's the last time any of them actually helped someone directly? The words had struck something deep inside her. When was the last time she'd helped someone without her wealth as a buffer? When had she last connected with another human being who didn't want something from her? Her parents had raised her with modest means. Her father, a high school teacher, her mother, a nurse. They'd taught her the value of hard work and kindness. But somewhere between her first million and her first billion, those lessons had gotten buried under board meetings and quarterly reports. Now, as she guided the Camry onto the highway, leaving the glittering city behind, Sarah felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. Her plan was simple but purposeful. Travel across America's heartland, find people who helped others without expectation of reward, learn from them, understand what she'd lost along the way. The car hummed along the interstate, its engine a far cry from her usual vehicle's purr. She'd deliberately chosen an older model that might need occasional repairs. It would give her genuine reasons to interact with local mechanics and communities. Her research team had compiled data on small towns known for their community spirit, but she'd decided to let fate and car troubles guide her path instead. A paper map lay open on the passenger seat. No GPS, no electronic trails. Her regular phones were locked in a safe back home, replaced by a basic prepaid model. The only technology she carried was a simple laptop for emerging company issues, tucked away in the trunk. As dawn broke over the mountains, Sarah smiled at her reflection in the rearview mirror. Gone were the perfectly styled hair and careful makeup, replaced by a simple ponytail and clean face. She looked ordinary. It felt extraordinary. A sign flashed past. "Welcome to Millbrook Valley, where kindness counts." Sarah checked her fuel gauge, still half full, but something told her this might be the place to start. Sometimes the universe had a way of pointing you in the right direction. What she didn't know yet was that in this small town, a humble mechanic was about to teach her lessons worth more than her entire fortune. The timing belt's death rattle grew louder as Sarah guided her Camry down Millbrook Valley's main street. She'd noticed the sound starting about 20 miles back, but had hoped to make it to the next major town. Now, as the engine coughed and stuttered, she realized that hope had been optimistic at best. A hand-painted sign caught her eye. "Morrison's Garage, open." Below it, in smaller letters, "If we can't fix it, you don't pay." She eased the struggling car into the gravel driveway just as the engine gave one final protest and died completely. Frank Morrison was arranging tools in his father's old red toolbox when he heard the distinctive sound of an engine in distress. He'd know that particular mechanical death knell anywhere, timing belt, definitely on its last legs. Setting down a wrench, he made his way to the door, grabbing the shop rag that perpetually hung from his belt loop. The woman climbing out of the Camry looked tired but composed, despite what must have been a stressful drive. Something about her struck him as unusual. Her posture, maybe, or the way she surveyed her surroundings with careful attention. "Sounds like your timing belt's about had enough," Frank called out, walking over. "I'm Frank Morrison." Sarah had rehearsed her cover story dozens of times, but something in the old mechanic's kind eyes made her want to be as honest as possible. "Sarah," she replied, offering only her first name. "I was hoping to make it further, but the car had other ideas." Frank was already popping the hood, his experienced hands finding their way through the engine compartment with practiced ease. Timing belts definitely gone. Could have been a lot worse. If it had broken completely, might have damaged your valves. He straightened up, wiping his hands. "Lucky you made it here when you did." "Can it be fixed?" Sarah asked, deliberately letting worry creep into her voice. It wasn't entirely an act. She really did need this car to continue her journey. "Course it can," Frank replied with a gentle smile. "Everything can be fixed with enough patience and the right tools. Might take a few hours, though. There's a diner down the street. Mary Beth makes the best apple pie in 3 counties. Sarah hesitated, playing her part. "I should ask about the cost." Frank waved away her concern. "Don't worry about that now. Let's get your car running first. Been doing this longer than you've been alive, I'd wager, and I've never left anyone stranded." As he began working, Sarah found herself lingering instead of heading to the diner. There was something fascinating about watching these weathered hands move with such confidence through the mechanical maze. Frank worked with an efficiency that spoke of decades of experience, but also with a gentleness that seemed at odds with the tough nature of his work. "Hand me that 14mm socket, would you?" he asked, pointing to his toolbox. "Red handle." Sarah found herself helping, passing tools and listening as Frank explained what he was doing. He taught without condescension, clearly taking pleasure in sharing his knowledge. When he discovered a worn coolant hose that could have caused problems down the road, he showed her the signs of wear. "Better to fix it now than have it leave you stranded somewhere less friendly," he said, already reaching for a replacement part. "Roads can get mighty lonely out there. You're not concerned about adding work you won't be paid for?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. Frank's laugh was warm and genuine. "Money's not everything, young lady. My father taught me that a mechanic's job isn't just fixing cars, it's helping people. Car trouble doesn't check your bank balance before striking." As the afternoon wore on, Sarah found herself sharing edited versions of her life story. Growing up in a Middle-class family, working hard, wanting to make a difference. All true, just not the whole truth. Frank listened while he worked, occasionally offering his own stories of life in Millbrook Valley. The failed timing belt sat on his workbench, a humble piece of rubber and fiber that had brought them together. Later, Sarah would look back on this moment. The smell of oil and metal, the sound of tools against engine parts, the easy wisdom in Frank's voice, and recognize it as the beginning of something extraordinary. The local newspaper clipping was yellowed with age, but the headline was still clear: "Local mechanic saves school bus during blizzard." Sarah found herself studying the grainy photo of a younger Frank Morrison, snow-covered and determined as she waited for him to finish with another customer's car. The article detailed how he'd trudged 3 miles through a snowstorm to repair a broken-down school bus full of children, refusing any payment for his service. "That was a cold day," Frank commented, catching her looking at the article. He wiped his hands on his shop rag, leaving fresh streaks of oil. But those kids needed to get home. Sarah felt a familiar twist of guilt in her stomach. Here was a man who'd spent his entire life being exactly who he appeared to be, while she pushed the thought away, focusing instead on the stack of invoices she'd offered to help organize. Most of them were marked "no charge" in Frank's neat handwriting. "Don't you ever worry about your own future?" she asked, genuinely curious. "Retirement? Emergencies?" Frank settled into his worn office chair, the leather cracked but comfortable. "Got everything I need. House is paid for, garden keeps me fed, and Helen, my late wife, she was smart. With our savings, not rich by any means but comfortable enough, figure that's all anyone really needs." The irony of his words wasn't lost on Sarah. Here she was, worth billions, searching for something this man had figured out long ago. She thought of her penthouse apartment, her fleet of luxury cars, her private jet, all the trappings of success that had somehow failed to bring fulfillment. A young woman burst into the garage, panic evident on her face. "Mr. Morrison, the delivery van. It won't start, and I've got perishables." "Easy now, Jenny," Frank soothed, already reaching for his tools. "Let's take a look." Sarah watched as he followed the distraught woman outside. Through the open door, she could hear him talking calmly, explaining what he was checking and why. Her fingers itched to reach for her phone, to transfer enough money, to set this whole town up for life. But she knew that would change everything. The authenticity, the genuine connections, the simple joy of neighbors helping neighbors. While Frank was gone, Sarah's eyes wandered to a framed photo on his desk. It showed him and his wife at what looked like a community picnic, surrounded by smiling faces. Helen Morrison had kind eyes and a warm smile that matched her husband's. Sarah wondered what she would think of the deception being played out in her husband's garage. The sound of a newspaper being folded caught her attention. An elderly man had settled into one of the waiting room chairs, his eyes fixed on the business section. Sarah's breath caught. There on the page he was reading was a small article about Reynolds Technologies. Her own face stared back at her from the photograph, though thankfully the man seemed more interested in the sports pages that followed. "Sometimes the hardest thing about telling the truth is finding the right moment for it," a voice said, making her jump. Frank had returned, and something in his expression suggested he'd noticed her discomfort. I haven't been entirely," Sarah started, but Frank held up a hand. "Everyone's got their stories," he said gently, "their reasons for being where they are. I figure when someone's ready to share, they will. Until then, well, actions speak louder than words, anyway." The wisdom in his simple statement struck her deeply. In her world of corporate takeovers and technological innovation, everything was about leverage and advantage. But here, in this humble garage, with its wall of thank-you notes and its generous proprietor, she was learning a different kind of value system. A school bus driver came in with questions about a strange noise, and Frank excused himself to help. Sarah watched. Him go, then turned back to the old newspaper article. The photographer had captured something essential about Frank Morrison, a fundamental decency that no amount of money could buy or replicate. She thought about her own headline from last month. Tech Titan. Sarah Reynolds announces revolutionary AI platform. The contrast between that glossy magazine cover and this yellowed newspaper clipping couldn't have been starker, yet somehow the old paper held a truth that all her press coverage had missed. The knock on Frank's garage door came early the next morning, just as he was setting up for the day. Sarah stood there, her Camry purring smoothly behind her. "I think I heard something," she said, though they both knew the car was running perfectly. Frank's eyes crinkled with amusement, but he played along. "Better take a look then. Can't be too careful with these timing belts." He reached for a worn repair manual from his shelf, its pages dog-eared and oil-stained from decades of use. "While we're at it, might as well teach you a thing or two about your car. Knowledge like this comes in handy on the road." Sarah found herself perched on a workshop stool, the old manual open between them. Frank's patient explanations made complex mechanical concepts seem simple, his weathered finger tracing diagrams as he spoke. "See here? That's your timing belt assembly. Understanding how it works means you'll know the warning signs next time." "My father tried to teach me about cars once," Sarah admitted, the memory surprisingly clear, "but I was always more interested in computers, thought I was too smart for mechanical things." She laughed softly. "Funny how life has a way of teaching you what really matters." "Nothing wrong with computers," Frank replied, reaching for a wrench. "But there's something special about working with your hands, feeling the metal, knowing how things fit together. Can't solve every problem with ones and zeros." The morning stretched into afternoon as Frank shared his knowledge. He taught her how to check oil levels, recognize the sound of worn brake pads, and spot the early signs of transmission trouble. The manual became their shared reference point, its pages telling stories of countless repairs and lessons learned. "This was my first real repair manual," Frank explained, carefully turning a grease-stained page. "Pop gave it to me when I started working here. Said a good mechanic needs 3 things: proper tools, proper knowledge, and a proper heart for helping others. Been using this book ever since." Sarah ran her fingers over the manual's worn cover, thinking about her own learning resources. Cutting-edge tablets, AI assistants, virtual reality simulations. Yet here was something that had stood the test of time, its value lying not just in the information it contained, but in the way it had been used to help others. "You should have this," Frank said, suddenly pushing the manual toward her. "Seems to me you're someone who appreciates learning, and knowledge ought to be passed on." "Oh, I couldn't," Sarah started to protest, but Frank was already writing something on the inside cover. "To Sarah," he read aloud as he wrote, "remember that every engine has a story, and every repair is a chance to help someone's day get a little better." From Frank. The simple gesture caught her off guard. In her world, gifts usually came with strings attached, expectations of reciprocity or advantage. But Frank's offering was pure, just like everything else about him. A customer arrived with a misfiring engine, and Sarah found herself automatically reaching for tools, eager to put her morning's lessons into practice. Frank watched approvingly as she helped diagnose the problem, her designer watch incongruous against the grease-stained work. "You're a natural," he commented as they worked. "Sometimes the best students are the ones who think they've got nothing left to learn." Sarah thought about the tech empire she'd built, the countless innovations she'd spearheaded. Here she was, learning basic auto repair from a small-town mechanic, and somehow it felt more meaningful than any corporate achievement. The repair manual sat on the workbench, its presence a reminder that some of life's most valuable lessons couldn't be measured in dollars or stock prices. She'd come to Millbrook Valley looking for authenticity, and instead she was finding something even more precious, a chance to remember who she'd been before success had changed her world. The community bulletin board in Frank's waiting room told the story of Millbrook Valley better than any history book could. Flyers for the upcoming Harvest Festival overlapped with Little League sign-ups and church bake sales. But what caught Sarah's attention were the handwritten notes. Need ride to doctor's appointment. Tuesday. Looking for help with yard work. Babysitter needed for evening shift. Next to each note was a small checkmark and Frank's initials. You help with all of these? She asked, gesturing to the board while Frank finished up some paperwork. Not directly, he replied, looking up with a smile. But I know people who can. Sometimes fixing problems is just about connecting folks who need help with folks who can give it. Sarah watched as Mrs. Chen from the local Chinese restaurant came in, not with car troubles, but with a concerned look. Frank, Tommy's graduation is next week, and the car we saved for, well, the dealer in Springfield. Let me guess, Frank interrupted gently. They're trying to sell you more car than you need at a price you can't afford? When Mrs. Chen nodded, he reached for his phone. Give me an hour. My friend Dave over in Harrison has a good used Civic he's been keeping in shape. Reliable, good on gas, perfect first car for a college kid. After Mrs. Chen left, visibly relieved, Sarah helped. Frank sought through some old parts. You seem to know everyone's story, she observed. In a town this size, stories are like engines. They're all connected. Tommy Chen's been saving every dollar from dishwashing at his parents' restaurant. Good kid. Got a scholarship to study. Engineering. Frank paused, remembering something. Actually, that reminds me. Could you watch the shop for an hour? Got to make a quick run. Sarah found herself alone in the garage, the responsibility both surprising and warming. The phone rang. Mrs. Rodriguez about a check engine light. Sarah surprised herself by handling it confidently, using the knowledge Frank had been teaching her. When Frank returned, he was carrying a box of dusty engineering textbooks. Found these in my attic. Helen used to teach science at the high school. Figured Tommy might find them useful. Throughout the day, Sarah watched the town's real social network in action. It wasn't based on likes or shares, but on actual human connections. The bulletin board served as its heart, with Frank as its unofficial coordinator. A teenager came in looking for work. Frank introduced him to Mr. Peterson, who needed help with yard maintenance. A young mother worried about her car making. The trip to her night classes, Frank not only fixed the car, but connected her with another student for carpooling. Frank! A booming voice interrupted the afternoon quiet. A tall man in a sheriff's uniform filled the doorway. Got your message. About Dave's Civic. Think you could look it over before Mrs. Chen makes the drive out? Already planned to, Jim, Frank replied. How's that cruiser running? Notice I fixed that shimmy in the steering? The sheriff grinned. Smooth as silk. Town council's been talking about giving you some kind of award, you know. 20 years of keeping our emergency vehicles running for parts cost only. Don't need awards, Frank waved it off. Just doing what needs doing. After the sheriff left, Sarah noticed a small plaque partially hidden behind some family photos. Millbrook Valley Citizen of the Year, 1998, it read. When she pointed it out, Frank shrugged. Got that the year of the big flood. Wasn't about me. Whole town came together. I just helped coordinate who needed what and who had boats. He gestured to the bulletin board. Same principle as that board there. People want to help. Sometimes they just need to know where help's needed. As evening approached, Sarah watched Frank add a new note to the board. Used engineering textbooks available, free to good home. Below it, he pinned a small card that read, Career counseling available. Ask Frank for details. Sometimes, he explained, catching her watching, people need more than just car repairs. They need someone to believe in their dreams a little. Sarah thought about her own dreams, buried under quarterly reports and shareholder expectations. She looked at the bulletin board, this analog social network that accomplished more real good than many of her tech innovations. Here was technology, at its most basic and most effective. A piece of cork, some paper, and a community's worth of caring hearts. The old recipe book sat open on Frank's small office desk, its pages spotted with cooking stains and handwritten notes in the margins. Helen's famous apple pie, read one recipe header. the cursive elegant despite the faded ink. It was late evening, and Sarah had stayed to help Frank organize some invoices when the conversation had drifted to memories. "She made this for every community gathering," Frank said, his finger tracing the familiar handwriting. "Said food was love made visible. The amount of butter in this recipe would shock your doctor, but nobody ever left a crumb on their plate." Sarah studied the recipe, noting Helen's little annotations: extra cinnamon on cold days, and remember to let Tommy Chen take extras home. Growing boy. The book wasn't just a collection of recipes, it was a chronicle of community care. "What about you?" Frank asked, closing the recipe book carefully. "You mentioned your parents earlier, teacher and nurse, wasn't it? Bet they had their own ways of helping people." Sarah felt the familiar tug between truth and deception. "They did," she replied, focusing on memories from before wealth had complicated everything. "Dad would spend hours after school tutoring kids who couldn't afford extra help. Mom, she'd remember every patient's family members' names, keep track of their stories. They taught me that success wasn't about what you had, but what you gave." She paused, the irony of her current situation hitting hard. "Sometimes I wonder if they'd recognize who I've become." Frank's eyes held understanding rather than judgment. "We all drift sometimes. Question is, what do we do when we realize we've drifted?" The evening shadows lengthened as they shared more stories. Frank spoke of Helen's battle with cancer, how the community had rallied around them. People brought food for months, all using Helen's recipes, said if they couldn't have her here, they'd at least cook like she taught them. Sarah found herself sharing more than she'd planned. "After my first big success," she said carefully, "everything changed. Old friends started asking for investments. New friends seemed more interested in what I could do for them than who I was. Started feeling like I was living in a bubble of artificial relationships." "Must get lonely at the top," Frank observed quietly, and something in his tone made Sarah wonder if he knew more than he let on. "Does it get easier?" she asked suddenly. "Missing her?" Frank's hands rested on the recipe book. "Different, not easier. Some days I'll fix a car and think, Helen would have loved hearing about this one. Or I'll help someone out of a jam and hear her voice saying, that's my Frank. She's still here in all the important ways." A moth fluttered against the window, drawn to the office's warm light. "You know what Helen would say about you?" Frank continued. "She'd say you're exactly where you need to be, figuring out what matters." Sarah thought about her corporate office, 84 floors above San Francisco. "And what do you say?" "I say everybody's got their own timing belt," he replied with a small smile. "Sometimes it needs adjusting, sometimes replacing. But the engine keeps running as long as you take care of what's important." The recipe book between them seemed to hold more than just cooking instructions. It was a testament to a life well lived, to connections that ran deeper than transactions, to love that outlasted loss. "There's something I should tell you," Sarah started, but Frank held up a hand. "When you're ready," he said gently. "Some revelations are like good pie crust. Can't rush them. They need their own time to settle." Outside, the first crickets of evening began their chorus. Frank carefully returned the recipe book to its shelf, next to a photo of Helen in her garden. Sarah watched him, understanding now that his generosity wasn't just about fixing cars. It was about honoring a love that had taught him the true value of helping others. The simple truth of it all hit her. Here she was, one of the wealthiest women in the world, finding more genuine connection in a small-town garage than in all her corporate boardrooms combined. And it had taken a grieving mechanic and his late wife's recipe book to show her what she'd been missing all along. The glossy business magazine lay innocently on the garage's waiting room table, mixed in with the usual auto repair journals and local newspapers. Sarah's heart nearly stopped when she saw her own face staring back from the cover under the headline, "Where is Sarah Reynolds? Tech's most influential CEO goes off-grid." She quickly slipped the magazine under a stack of catalogues just as Frank returned from lunch. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here she was, hiding evidence of her true identity. in the very place she'd come to find authenticity. Her burner phone buzzed. Marcus, her CFO, had somehow gotten this number. The text was urgent. Board meeting emergency. Media speculation growing. Need statement ASAP. Where are you? She typed back quickly. Trust me. Company doing fine. Stick to plan. Then she turned the phone off completely. Frank was showing a young apprentice how to diagnose a transmission problem when Sarah's laptop chimed from her bag. The emergency alert she'd set up to monitor news about Reynolds Technologies. A financial blog had just published a speculative piece. Sources suggest Reynolds spotted in Midwest. Stock volatility continues. Everything all right? Frank asked, noticing her distraction. You look like you've seen a ghost. Just some news from home, she managed, closing the laptop quickly. The afternoon brought more signs that her carefully constructed anonymity was cracking. A customer reading news on his phone mentioned something about a female CEO going missing. Probably ran off with the company money, he speculated, not noticing how Sarah's hands tensed around the wrench she was holding. Folks love a good mystery, Frank commented after the customer left, but I've found the truth is usually simpler than the stories people make up. Sarah worked alongside Frank, trying to lose herself in the honest simplicity of mechanical problems. But her mind kept returning to the magazine hidden under the catalogues, to the growing digital footprint that threatened to lead straight to Millbrook Valley. You ever feel like you're living two lives? She asked Frank as they cleaned tools at day's end. He studied her for a moment. Everyone's got layers, Sarah. Like an engine. What you see on top isn't always the whole story. He paused, wiping a wrench thoughtfully. But in my experience, trying to run an engine on two different fuels usually leads to trouble. The local evening news played quietly in the background, and Sarah froze when she heard her name. The reporter was discussing Reynolds Technologies' stock fluctuations in her absence. The photo they used was from last year's tech conference. Sarah in a power suit, looking every bit the corporate titan she was trying to escape. Frank's back was turned, focusing on organizing his toolbox, but Sarah saw him glance at the TV's reflection in the window. A long moment passed before he spoke again. You know, he said carefully, when you're fixing cars, timing is everything. Too early or too late with a repair, and you can do more harm than good. He turned to face her. Same goes for other things. In life, Sarah's throat tightened. Did he know? Had he figured it out? But before she could respond, a truck pulled into the garage with smoking brakes, demanding immediate attention. As they worked together to fix the truck's brake lines, Sarah felt the weight of her deception growing heavier. The magazine under the catalogues seemed to burn in her awareness, like a check engine light warning of trouble ahead. The truth was becoming like one of Frank's mechanical problems. The longer you left it, the more complicated the fix became. But unlike a car repair, she wasn't sure there was a manual for this situation. Late that night, after Frank had gone home, Sarah returned to the garage to retrieve the magazine. But when she lifted the catalogues, it was gone. In its place was a small note in Frank's neat handwriting. Sometimes the best maintenance is preventive. F. The drawing showed Frank in a cape made of wrenches, tool belt gleaming like something from a superhero movie. 8-year-old Danny Martinez had spent his entire Saturday morning in the garage, watching Frank teach basic auto maintenance to a group of teenagers. While the older kids learned about spark plugs and oil changes, Danny had settled in with his crayons, creating his masterpiece. Look, Mr. Frank, Danny held up the picture proudly. It's you saving everybody's cars. Frank accepted the drawing. With the same careful respect, he'd show a valuable blueprint. Well, would you look at that, he said, studying the details. You've even got my red rag in there, though I don't usually fly while I'm working on engines. Sarah, watching from her now usual spot by the workbench, noticed how Frank immediately walked over to his wall of children's artwork and carefully pinned Danny's contribution in a prominent spot. The wall was a rainbow of creativity. Dozens of drawings showing Frank in various heroic poses, always fixing something, always helping. Later that afternoon, while Frank was out picking up parts, Sarah overheard Danny's mother worrying about upcoming school expenses. The single mum worked 2 jobs, and Danny's growing feet meant new shoes were needed again. The next morning, a package appeared on the Martinez's doorstep: new shoes, school supplies, and a gift card to the local clothing store. The anonymous note simply read, "From a friend of the community." When Danny came by the garage that afternoon, proudly wearing his new shoes, Sarah pretended to be as surprised as everyone else. But Frank caught her eye with a knowing look that made her wonder if her secret generosity was as anonymous as she'd thought. The teenagers who'd attended Frank's impromptu auto class started showing up regularly. Sarah watched as Frank turned basic maintenance lessons into something more, teaching responsibility, the value of hard work, and the importance of helping others. "See this engine," he'd say, pointing to various parts. "Every piece has a purpose, just like every person. In a community, when one part helps another do its job better, the whole thing runs smoother." Sarah found herself joining these sessions, sharing what she'd learned from Frank while adding her own insights. She taught them about budgeting for car ownership, explaining depreciation and maintenance costs in terms they could understand. The irony of a secret billionaire teaching financial responsibility wasn't lost on her. One day, a young girl named Maria stayed after class, clutching a worn notebook. "Mr. Frank says you're good with numbers," she said shyly to Sarah. "I want to study engineering, but..." Before she could finish, Frank appeared with a stack of Helen's old engineering textbooks. "Found these while cleaning. They need a good home, and something tells me they'd be put to good use with you." Sarah watched the girl's eyes light up. Later that week, an anonymous donor established a STEM scholarship fund at the local high school. When Frank heard the news, he just smiled and kept working on a timing belt replacement. The wall of children's artwork grew, each new edition telling a story of lives touched and lessons learned. Danny's superhero drawing of Frank had inspired others. Now there were pictures of the whole unofficial auto class, including one of Sarah teaching under the hood of a car, her own makeshift cape made of calculation sheets. "Never thought I'd see myself as a superhero," Sarah mused one evening, studying the latest artistic edition. "Real heroes don't need capes," Frank replied, replacing tools in his father's old red toolbox. "They just need to care enough to help where they can." Sarah thought about the quiet ways Frank had shaped this community. One repair, one lesson, one kind act at a time. Her own anonymous gifts felt small in comparison to the lasting impact of his daily dedication. That night, after everyone had left, Sarah added her own contribution to the wall, a detailed technical drawing of an engine, annotated with life lessons Frank had taught her. At the bottom, she wrote, "Sometimes the most powerful upgrades aren't to engines, but to hearts." When Frank found it the next morning, he smiled and added it to the collection without comment. But Sarah noticed it held a special place. Right next to Danny's superhero portrait, where the morning sun would catch it first. The emergency toolkit rattled in Frank's truck as they sped through the darkening afternoon. The storm had hit Millbrook Valley with unexpected ferocity, dropping 3 inches of rain in just 2 hours. Now, as thunder rolled overhead, Frank's ancient pickup pushed through flooding streets toward yet another stranded motorist. "Third call in an hour?" Frank said, squinting through windshield wipers that could barely keep up with the deluge. Thompson families stuck out by Miller's Creek, waters rising fast. Sarah gripped the toolkit, a battered metal box she'd seen Frank reach for countless times over the past weeks. Inside were tools he'd carefully curated over decades: specialized wrenches, a hand-powered tire pump, waterproof flashlights, and emergency repair supplies. Each item had its own story of crisis averted, disaster prevented. They found the Thompsons' minivan trapped where the creek had overflowed its banks. Mrs. Thompson sat inside with her 3 children, trying to keep them calm as water lapped at the vehicle's doors. Frank pulled up on higher ground, already reaching for his toolkit. "Stay put," he called out through the storm. "We'll get you out." Sarah watched in amazement as Frank worked. Despite the howling wind and pelting rain, his hands remained steady, his movements precise. He used a specialized pump from his kit to check if water had entered the engine, then expertly connected a tow strap. "Sarah, when I give the signal, ease forward slowly," he instructed, his voice carrying the same calm authority he used when teaching teenagers about spark plugs. The rescue took 20 minutes of careful maneuvering, but soon the Thompson family was safe in Frank's truck. As they drove them home, Sarah noticed how Frank had packed extra blankets and thermoses of hot coffee in his emergency supplies, as if he'd anticipated every need. The radio crackled with another call for help, then another. As the storm intensified, Frank's toolkit proved invaluable at each stop. He used his hand-cranked tire pump to inflate a flat in the middle of the downpour, employed waterproof tape to seal a leaking window, and utilized every specialized tool with the expertise of someone who'd spent a lifetime preparing for moments like this. At the height of the storm, they received word that old Joe's diabetes medication was running low, and he was trapped by flooding on his rural property. The main road was underwater, but Frank knew another way. "There's a back route through the Henderson farm," he said, already turning the truck. "Bit rough, but the toolkit's got everything we need if we run into trouble." Sarah held the toolkit on her lap as they bounced along the muddy track. She could feel the weight of its history. How many storms had this box weathered? How many people had been helped by its contents? The night wore on, each emergency call leading to another. Frank's toolkit seemed bottomless, producing exactly what was needed each time. A specialized wrench for a stuck door, waterproof matches for a stranded family, emergency flares for dangerous intersections. Near midnight, they helped the local doctor reach a patient in need, their truck becoming an impromptu ambulance. As Frank used his toolkit's flashlights to illuminate the flooded path, Sarah realized something. This wasn't just about mechanical repairs anymore. This was about community survival. "How did you know?" she asked during a brief, quiet moment. "To have all these specific tools ready?" Frank adjusted his rain-soaked cap. "Experience teaches you to listen to what your community needs. Every tool in that kit was added because someone sometime needed it. Each one's got a lesson behind it." The storm began to ease as dawn approached. They'd helped over 20 families through the night, Frank's toolkit serving as their constant ally. As they finally headed back to the garage, Sarah studied the old box with new appreciation. Like everything else about Frank, it represented preparation meeting generosity, knowledge serving need. Later that morning, as the sun broke through and the floodwaters began to recede, Sarah watched Frank clean and check each tool before returning it to its place. He did it with the same care she'd seen him show to Danny's superhero drawing or Helen's recipe book, the attention of someone who understood that objects carried stories and stories carried power. "You know," Frank said, closing the toolkit, with a familiar click, "sometimes the best tools aren't the ones that fix engines. They're the ones that help you fix lives." It was a business card that finally threatened to unravel everything. Sarah had been careful, but in the aftermath of the storm, while helping Frank sort through wet paperwork in the garage, it slipped from her wallet. Just a small piece of white cardstock, but the embossed letters caught the light. "Sarah Reynolds, CEO, Reynolds Technologies." She snatched it up quickly, but not before Frank's apprentice Tommy glanced over. The confusion on his face was immediate. "Hey, isn't that the missing billionaire they've been talking about on the news?" "Just a coincidence," Sarah said too quickly, shoving the card deep into her pocket. "Common name." But she could feel the weight of Frank's gaze, though he kept his attention seemingly focused on the paperwork. The silence that followed felt heavy with unspoken questions. The local diner buzzed with speculation that afternoon. Sarah sat at the counter, picking at a piece of pie, while snippets of conversation drifted around her. "Did you see that news story about the tech CEO?" one patron asked. "They say she might be somewhere in the Midwest." My cousin in Kansas swears he saw her at a gas station, another replied. But why would a billionaire pump her own gas? Mary, Beth the waitress, joined in. Reminds me of that woman who's been helping out at Frank's garage. She's got that way about her. You know what I mean? Sarah felt her face grow hot. She left money on the counter and hurried out, but not before hearing someone say, "Come to think of it, she does look kind of familiar." Back at the garage, Frank was working under the hood of a Chevy, his movements deliberate and focused. A partially hidden business card sat on his desk, not hers, but similar. He'd clearly been thinking about what he'd seen. "Folks in town are talking," he said without looking up from the engine, "about that missing CEO. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she reached for a wrench. "Frank, pass me that 3/8 socket," he interrupted gently. "You know, when I was young, my dad taught me something important about engines. Said they'll tell you what's wrong if you just listen carefully enough. Same goes for people." The socket felt cold in Sarah's palm as she handed it over. What if someone isn't who everyone thinks they are?" Frank straightened up, wiping his hands on his red shop rag. "Depends. Are they not who others think they are, or not who they think they should be?" Before Sarah could respond, Tommy burst into the garage, waving his phone. "Mr. Morrison, look at this." The screen showed a news article with Sarah's corporate headshot. "It's her, isn't it? She looks just like—" "Tommy!" Frank cut in firmly. "Don't you have that transmission to work on?" The young apprentice hesitated, looking between them, then retreated to the back of the garage. But the damage was done. Sarah could feel her carefully constructed world starting to crack. "The thing about secrets," Frank said quietly, turning back to the Chevy's engine, "is they're like oil leaks. You can patch them up for a while, but eventually they find their way to the surface." Sarah touched the business card in her pocket. "What if the truth changes everything?" "Truth has a way of doing that," Frank agreed. "But in my experience, it's the hiding that does the real damage." He picked up the business card from his desk, studied it for a moment, then offered it to her. "When you're ready to talk about it, I'll be here. Until then, these spark plugs won't replace themselves." The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of routine repairs and careful silences. Sarah could feel the truth pressing against her chest like a physical weight. Every time the shop door opened, she tensed, expecting reporters or board members, or anyone who might recognize the missing CEO of Reynolds Technologies. But for now, in this moment, she was still just Sarah, Frank's helper, learning about cars and community and what really matters. The business card burned in her pocket like a countdown timer, ticking away the moments until everything would change. The headlines exploded across every screen in Millbrook Valley like a series of controlled detonations. Tech billionaire found, Sarah Reynolds discovered in small Midwest town. The morning news vans arrived before dawn, their satellite dishes rising above Frank's garage like mechanical sunflowers tracking the light. Reynolds Technologies, CEO's secret life as small-town mechanic's apprentice, screamed the newspaper someone had left on Frank's workbench. The photo beneath showed Sarah in her designer corporate attire, juxtaposed against a grainy shot of her handing Frank a wrench just days ago. The contrast was stark. Power suit versus oil-stained work shirt, boardroom versus garage. Frank arrived early as usual, navigating through the growing crowd of reporters with the same calm determination he used to diagnose engine troubles. Inside, he found Sarah already there, staring at the newspaper. "Guess my timing belt finally broke," she said weakly. The phone wouldn't stop ringing. Local news, national networks, business reporters, all wanting the story of why America's most innovative tech leader had gone incognito in a small-town garage. Outside, cameras captured every angle of the modest building, as if the weathered walls might reveal some secret. "Miss Reynolds!" The shouts from outside grew louder. "Is this a publicity stunt? Are you having a breakdown? Is Reynolds Technologies in trouble?" The door opened, and Mary Beth from the diner slipped in, carrying coffee and breakfast sandwiches. "Thought you might need these," she said, setting them down. "And Sarah, or Miss Reynolds, whatever you prefer, that anonymous donation to Joey's cancer treatment fund." "Thank you." Sarah blinked in surprise. "How did you—" "Small town," Mary Beth shrugged. "We notice things, even when people try to be subtle about their kindness." More townspeople began arriving, not to gawk, but to form a protective barrier between the garage and the media circus. Mrs. Thompson, whom they'd helped during the storm, brought homemade cookies. Old Joe arrived with his truck, parking it strategically to block the most aggressive photographers. Tommy came in through the back door, looking sheepish. "I'm sorry about yesterday, Ms. Sarah. I didn't mean to—" "It's okay, Tommy," Sarah interrupted. "And it's still just Sarah, at least, I hope it can be." Frank had been quietly working on a carburetor, seemingly unfazed by the chaos. Now he straightened up, wiping his hands. "Well, since secrets are out in the open," he walked to his desk and pulled out a folder. Inside was every article about Sarah's disappearance, along with notes about suspicious similarities he'd noticed. "Been keeping this since that first business magazine showed up. Figured you'd talk about it when you were ready." "You knew all this time?" "Known since the second week," he replied. "That day you explained the computer-controlled fuel injection system to Tommy. Little too thorough for someone just learning cars." He smiled. "Plus, you use the same hand gestures when you're explaining things as you did in that tech conference." A video. The revelation hit Sarah hard. All this time, she'd been discovering authenticity while living a lie, and Frank had simply waited, teaching and accepting her regardless of her identity. Outside, the media continued their frenzy. Headlines updated by the minute on phones and tablets across town. Inside Reynolds' secret life, Tech Queen's small-town masquerade. Wall Street reacts to Reynolds' rural sabbatical. But inside the garage, something remarkable was happening. People kept coming in, not to question or accuse, but to share stories of how both Frank and Sarah had helped them. Each person who entered carried a piece of the larger truth. That identity wasn't about titles or bank accounts, but about actions and impact. Mrs. Chen brought lunch from her restaurant, setting up an impromptu buffet in the waiting room. "No cameras in here," she announced firmly to a reporter who tried to follow her in. "This is family space, family space." The words echoed in Sarah's mind as she looked around the garage that had become more home than her penthouse ever was. The headlines had exposed her identity, but they'd revealed something else too. The true nature of community, the authentic connections she'd been seeking all along. Frank picked up a wrench, holding it out to her with a familiar gesture. "Well," he said, "that Jenkins minivan still needs its transmission looked at. Unless you're too much of a billionaire now to get your hands dirty." Sarah took the wrench, feeling its comfortable weight. "Never," she replied, and meant it. Evening settled over Millbrook Valley like a soft blanket, bringing with it a blessed quiet after the chaos of the day. Most of the news vans had departed, promising to return tomorrow. In Frank's garage, the old photo album lay open on his workbench. A leather-bound chronicle of 30 years of service to the community. "Thought you might want to see this," Frank said, carefully turning pages filled with faded photographs. "Sometimes to understand where you are, you need to see where you've been." Sarah sat beside him, her CEO persona stripped away by exhaustion and relief. The first photos showed a much younger Frank standing proudly in front of the newly opened garage. "Dad took that one," he explained, "said every man needs photographic proof of the moment he finds his purpose." Page after page told the story of a life dedicated to others. Frank fixing Mrs. Wilson's car so she could drive to her daughter's wedding. Frank teaching a teenage boy about engines, the same boy who was now the town's fire chief. Frank and Helen at community gatherings, surrounded by people whose lives they'd touched. "I've been thinking about purpose lately," Sarah said, touching a photo of Frank working on a school bus. "I built Reynolds Technologies to change the world through innovation. Somewhere along the way, I forgot that change happens one person at a time. Frank nodded, turning another page. Technology's a lot like tools. It's not good or bad on its own. What matters is how you use it and why. He pointed to a picture of himself training a young mechanic. Take Tommy. Boy's brilliant with computers, but he needed to learn that every machine has a human story behind it. They reached a section of the album dedicated to Helen. Photos showed her organizing community events, teaching science classes, creating the networks of care that still sustained Millbrook Valley. Helen understood something I took years to learn, Frank said softly. Success isn't measured by what you have, but by what you give away. Sarah thought about the billions attached to her name, the corporate empire she'd built. I came here looking for something real, she admitted. Every relationship in my world seemed transactional. Every kindness had an agenda behind it. I needed to remember who I was before the money changed everything. And who are you, Sarah Reynolds? The question hung in the air as she studied a recent addition to the album. A photo of herself and Frank teaching the teenage auto class. In it, she was explaining engine timing, while Frank looked on with quiet approval. The joy on her face was genuine, unscripted. I'm someone who lost her way, she said finally. Someone who built a company focused on connecting people through technology, but forgot how to connect with them herself. She gestured to the album. These photos, they're not just memories. They're proof that one person, choosing to care consistently, can weave a community together. Frank turned to the album's final pages, which were empty. Helen always left blank pages, he explained. Said the best stories are the ones still being written. Outside, a few persistent reporters waited in the growing darkness. Their presence was a reminder that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions about how to move forward. But here, in the quiet of the garage, surrounded by photographic evidence of lives touched and changed, Sarah felt something shifting inside her. The board wants me back in San Francisco, she said. The shareholders are nervous. The press is spinning stories about mental breakdowns and corporate instability. I should go back, deal with the fallout. Frank closed the album carefully, his weathered hands resting on its cover. Should is a tricky word. Engines don't run on should, they run on is. Question is, what story do you want these blank and pages to tell? Sarah looked around the garage, at the wall of children's drawings, at Helen's recipe book, at the tools that had taught her more about human connection than all her years in corporate boardrooms. I want them to tell a story about remembering what matters, she said, about using success to make a real difference, not just a profitable one. Well then, Frank smiled, standing up and reaching for his toolbox. Sounds like we've got some work to do. Tommy's bringing in a tricky transmission problem tomorrow. Might as well show those reporters what a billionaire mechanic can really do. The old photo album sat between them, its blank pages waiting. In its leather-bound wisdom, it seemed to understand something vital, that the best stories aren't about who we appear to be, but about who we choose to become. The blueprint spread across Frank's workbench was unlike anything he usually dealt with. Instead of engine schematics or repair diagrams, this showed the plans for something much bigger. A state-of-the-art community center, with the garage as its heart. See here. Sarah pointed to a section of the drawing, her finger tracing the clean lines. We keep the original garage exactly as it is, that's non-negotiable. But we add modern training facilities, a technology lab and a community space. A place where your practical wisdom meets modern innovation. Frank studied the plans with the same careful attention he gave to complicated engine problems. His expression was unreadable as he took in the details. Classrooms for automotive training, computer labs for technical education, and a large community hall named Helen's Heart. It's a lot to take in, he said finally, straightening up. Pretty grand vision for a small town. Sarah watched his reaction carefully. Too grand? Not too grand, he replied slowly. Just want to make sure we don't lose what makes this place special. All these fancy additions, They won't mean anything if we lose the spirit of what we do here. That's exactly why I need you to help shape this, Sarah said earnestly. I've got the resources, but you've got the wisdom. You understand what this community really needs. The blueprint seemed to glow under the garage's fluorescent lights, full of possibility and potential pitfalls. Frank traced the outline of the original garage with his finger, thinking. Tell me about this part, he said, pointing to a section labeled Apprenticeship Program. Sarah's eyes lit up. That's where we combine old-school knowledge with new technology. Students learn traditional mechanics from experienced mentors, like you, while also studying modern automotive systems and computer diagnostics. We create opportunities for kids like Tommy, full scholarships, job training, real futures. Frank nodded slowly. And the garage stays free for those who need it? Always, Sarah assured him. That's fundamental. We create a foundation to cover all costs. The community center generates revenue through its programs, but the garage maintains its original mission. Your father's toolbox stays right where it belongs. The mention of his father's toolbox seemed to touch something in Frank. He walked over to it, running his hand across its worn surface. Dad always said a mechanic's job was fixing more than just cars. Said we fix hope, give people back their dignity. That's what I want to scale up, Sarah said softly. Not replace what you've built, but amplify it. Help more people, create more opportunities, but keep the heart of it intact. Frank picked up the blueprint again, studying the section labeled Helen's Heart. Tell me about this community hall. It's a space for everything Helen believed in. Community gatherings, educational programs, support groups. A place where her recipe book becomes cooking classes for kids, where her science lessons live on through STEM programs for girls. A way to keep her spirit of caring alive. A long moment passed as Frank absorbed this vision of the future. Outside, the usual sounds of Millbrook Valley drifted in, children playing, cars passing, life going on. Finally, he spoke. You know, when Helen was sick, she made me promise something. Said I had to keep helping people, but also that I had to be willing to let help come to me sometimes. He smiled slightly. Might be time to keep both parts of that promise. Sarah held her breath. Does that means we've got work to do, Frank said, reaching for a pencil. This training area here needs to be bigger, and we'll want a proper lift in the teaching garage. If we're going to do this, let's do it right. For the next few hours, they bent over the blueprint together, Frank's practical experience meeting Sarah's innovative vision. They adjusted, erased, redrew, and refined. The result was something neither of them could have created alone, a perfect blend of tradition and progress, heart and innovation. As evening approached, the blueprint had evolved from a corporate proposal into a shared dream. But more than that, it had become a bridge between Sarah's two worlds, a way to honor both who she had been and who she was becoming. The first scholarship certificate bore Tommy Chen's name in elegant calligraphy. It hung in Frank's garage below the wall of children's drawings, a bridge between the old and the new. Full mechanical engineering scholarship, Morrison Reynolds. Community program, it proclaimed, marking the beginning of something extraordinary. First of many, Sarah said, watching Tommy's parents photograph the certificate for what must have been the 20th time. Mrs. Chen was crying, while Mr. Chen kept shaking Frank's hand and thanking him repeatedly. University, Mrs. Chen exclaimed. My Tommy, going to be an engineer, but still learning from Mr. Frank, still helping our community. The program was elegantly simple. Students would split their time between formal engineering studies and practical apprenticeship at the garage. Theory and practice, innovation and tradition, perfectly balanced. Frank stood back, observing the scene with quiet satisfaction. He'd insisted that every scholarship recipient must commit to mentoring others, ensuring that knowledge would continue to flow through generations. Circle of helping, he called it, in his characteristically straightforward way. The garage itself was gradually transforming. Modern diagnostic equipment now sat comfortably beside Frank's traditional tools. Young apprentices learned to use, both understanding that technology should enhance, not replace, human wisdom and experience. "Check this out," Tommy called excitedly, showing a group of younger students how to use a new diagnostic tablet. "But remember what Mr. Frank says. The computer tells you where to look, but your hands and ears tell you what's wrong." Sarah had worried that the changes might diminish the garage's charm, but Frank's influence kept everything grounded. He'd insisted that the free repairs continue, that the door remain open to anyone in need. The only difference was that now they could help more people in more ways. "Had an interesting case yesterday," Frank told Sarah as they watched Tommy teach. "Young woman's car kept stalling. Computer said it was the fuel injection, but something didn't feel right. Had the kids used both methods, digital diagnostics and old-school troubleshooting. Turned out to be a wiring problem the computer couldn't detect. Good lesson for them." The scholarship certificate caught the afternoon light, making its gold seal gleam. Below it, a sign-up sheet for the next community auto maintenance class was already full. The names represented a cross-section of Millbrook Valley, retirees wanting to understand their vehicles better, single parents looking to save on repair, costs, teenagers dreaming of engineering careers. "You know what Helen would say about all this?" Frank asked, adjusting a wrench in his toolbox. "What's that?" "She'd say we're not just fixing cars anymore. We're fixing futures," Sarah thought. About her corporate office in San Francisco, with its pristine walls and cutting-edge technology. She still flew back regularly for board meetings, but her heart remained here, where true innovation was measured in changed lives rather than profit margins. The door chimed as a new customer entered, a nervous teenager with an old Honda that had seen better days. Sarah watched as Frank directed Tommy to handle the initial consultation, stepping in only when needed. The easy transfer of knowledge, the building of confidence, the sharing of wisdom, it was all there in that simple interaction. "Car's not too bad," Tommy reported, returning from his inspection. "But the owner, she's trying to keep it running, so she can get to college classes, working 2 jobs to make it happen." Frank and Sarah exchanged glances. Without a word, Sarah reached for the growing stack of scholarship applications on the desk. Some problems needed more than just mechanical solutions. Later that evening, as they closed up the garage, Frank paused by Tommy's scholarship certificate. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "Dad always said a good tool becomes better with use. Same's true for good ideas, I reckon." Sarah looked around at what they'd built together. The blending of her resources with Frank's wisdom, of corporate power with community heart. The scholarship certificate was more than just a piece of paper. It was proof that the right combination of old and new could create something truly transformative. "Your father would be proud," she said softly. "Helen too." Frank smiled, reaching for the lights. "They'd be proud of all of us. Now about tomorrow's class." The vintage Mustang gleamed under the garage lights, its restored surface reflecting the culmination of months of collaborative work. Frank and Sarah stood back, admiring how the classic car embodied everything they'd built together, a perfect fusion of traditional craftsmanship and modern innovation. "Helen always wanted me to restore one of these," Frank said, running his hand along the car's pristine fender. "Said every mechanic needs one project that's just for the joy of it." They'd found the car in a barn outside town, more rust than metal. Now it represented everything their partnership stood for. Frank's expertise guiding the mechanical restoration, while Sarah's resources and technical knowledge had helped source rare parts and integrate modern safety features without compromising the car's classic character. "Remember when we couldn't get the original radio working?" Sarah smiled, sliding into the driver's seat. "Now it plays digital music while looking completely stock." She pressed a button, and Helen's favorite song flowed through carefully hidden speakers. The restoration had become a community project, Tommy had learned valuable lessons about electrical systems, local kids had helped with the simpler tasks, and even some of Sarah's tech engineers had gotten involved, creating custom solutions for modernizing the classic vehicle while preserving its authenticity. The car wasn't just a restoration project, it had become a teaching tool, a symbol of how old and new could work together. During the process, Sarah had found herself spending more time in overalls than business suits, and she'd never been happier. "Board meeting tomorrow?" Frank asked, noting how she was studying the car's reflection. "Video conference," Sarah replied. "Running a tech company from a small-town garage isn't conventional, but then again, neither are we." She'd transformed. Reynolds Technologies culture, emphasizing human connection alongside technological innovation. Her corporate team had learned to measure success not just in profits, but in positive impact. The garage itself had evolved naturally. Modern diagnostic computers sat comfortably beside Frank's father's old toolbox. Young apprentices learned to trust both digital readouts and the sound of an engine, understanding that true expertise meant knowing when to use each. Local businesses had started leaving thank you notes on the bulletin board, not just for car repairs, but for the way the garage had transformed the community. The tech education program had created new opportunities, while Frank's insistence on maintaining free repairs for those in need kept their original mission alive. "Got something to show you," Frank said, walking to his office. He returned with a small photo album, newer than his usual one. Inside were pictures of their journey. Sarah's first day as an apprentice, the storm rescue efforts, Tommy receiving his scholarship, and dozens of moments in between. "Helen always said every good story needs documenting," he explained. "Turning pages filled with their shared history. Thought maybe we should start our own album." Sarah studied a recent photo of herself teaching a computer coding class to local kids, while Frank demonstrated basic engine maintenance in the background. The image captured everything they'd accomplished, breaking down barriers between different worlds, creating something entirely new while honoring what came before. "Speaking of documentation," she said, reaching into her bag, "look what got approved today." She pulled out official papers for the Morrison Reynolds Foundation, which would ensure the garage's mission continued for generations. The document listed both their names as co-founders, equal partners in preserving and growing their shared vision. Frank studied the papers with the same careful attention he gave to complex repairs. "Pretty fancy letterhead for a couple of grease monkeys," he joked, but his eyes were suspiciously bright. Outside, the sounds of Millbrook Valley drifted in. Children leaving school, cars passing, life continuing its steady rhythm. But now those sounds carried new possibilities. Young people with real futures, a community growing stronger, two different worlds learning to speak each other's language. The Mustang stood between them, its restored surface reflecting their images side by side. The billionaire tech CEO and the small-town mechanic who had discovered that the distance between their worlds wasn't as vast as it had seemed. In its polished chrome, they could see everything they'd built together and everything still to come. The new sign caught the morning sunlight, its fresh paint gleaming above the expanded garage. Morrison and Reynolds Community Garage, where every engine has a story. It was a small change that represented something much bigger. The official partnership of two people who had transformed not just a business, but an entire community. The grand opening of the community center was set for noon, but Frank was in his usual spot by dawn, organizing tools and checking the day's schedule. Sarah found him there, just as she had that first day when her carefully planned breakdown brought her into his life. "Ready for the circus?" she asked, handing him his morning coffee. "As ready as a timing belt with new tension," he replied. With a wink, they'd developed their own language over the months, blending automotive terms with life lessons until the two became inseparable. The original garage space remained unchanged, exactly as Frank's father had designed it. But now it opened into a larger facility where innovation and tradition worked hand in hand. Through the connecting door, they could see Tommy setting up for his first official class as a certified instructor, newly returned from his engineering program. "Sometimes I wonder what Helen would make of all this," Frank mused, straightening. A photo of her on the wall. Tech billionaire comes to town, turns everything upside down, and finds herself turned right side up in the process, Sarah finished. She'd kept her position as CEO of Reynolds Technologies, but now ran it differently, using Millbrook Valley's lessons to create genuine human connections in the digital world. The first visitors began arriving, not just for car repairs, but for classes, community programs, and the simple comfort of belonging. Mrs. Chen brought breakfast for everyone, telling anyone who would listen about Tommy's success. Old Joe came to show off his restored truck, a project that had involved both traditional mechanics and modern upgrades. A young girl tugged at Sarah's sleeve, holding up a drawing. It showed the garage as it was now, old and new sections, together, with Frank and Sarah standing side by side under a rainbow. "For the wall," she said proudly, pointing to the collection of children's artwork that had grown to cover an entire section of the original garage. Frank took the drawing with ceremonial solemnity, picking the perfect spot for it. "Right here," he declared, "where everyone can see the future we're building." As noon approached, the space filled with people whose lives had been touched by their partnership. Students from the tech program demonstrated their projects alongside traditional automotive repairs. The scholarship wall displayed dozens of certificates now, each representing a life changed, a future brightened. Sarah's corporate board members, who had flown in for the occasion, found themselves engaged in conversations with local mechanics about the human side of innovation. The barrier between Silicon Valley and Millbrook Valley had dissolved, replaced by a shared understanding that true progress meant leaving no one behind. "Time for the ribbon cutting," Frank announced, reaching for his father's old scissors, the same ones that had opened the garage decades ago. "Want to do the honors together?" Before Sarah could respond, Tommy stepped forward. "Actually, we all have something else planned first." The crowd parted to reveal a covered object. Tommy pulled away the sheet to display a brand new toolbox, painted the same red as Frank's father's. "For the next generation," he explained, "and for all the generations after that." Sarah noticed Frank's eyes growing misty as they read the inscription, "The Morrison Reynolds Legacy, Fixing Cars, Building Futures." Inside, they found tools both old and new, each chosen to represent their shared philosophy that progress didn't mean forgetting where you came from. As they finally cut the ribbon together, Frank's steady hands next to Sarah's, the gathered crowd erupted in cheers. But above the noise, Sarah heard Frank's quiet words. "You know what makes an engine run best?" "What's that?" she asked, though she knew the answer. "Having all its parts working together, each one doing exactly what it was meant to do." He smiled at her. "Took us a while, but I'd say we finally got everything running just right." Sarah looked around at what they'd built. Not just a building or a program, but a bridge between worlds, a place where everyone could find their purpose and their people. Perfect.